I was a security guard working the night shift at a revered cemetery, and little did I know that my assignment would become a terrifying nightmare. It got off to a fairly innocent start with the typical sounds of rustling leaves and far-off owls hooting. However, as the nights wore on, a menacing presence started to emerge. One fateful evening, as I patrolled the cemetery grounds, a chill ran down my spine. My entire body felt uneasy as the temperature dropped and the air became icy. My shoulder was also lightly touched by the cold. I spun around, hoping to catch a coworker pulling a practical joke, but all I saw was the eerie silence. Whispered words with an otherworldly weight were carried on the wind. Although barely audible, they were haunting. They remained as elusive as the ghosts that prowled among the graves, despite my best efforts to understand what they were saying. I had the impression that the dead's spirits were beckoning to me from the other side of the veil, their presence inexplicably connected to the sacred space. Before my eyes could fully comprehend the shape of the shadows, which were dancing and swaying and moving with an ethereal grace, they vanished into the mist. They appeared to be alive and were infused with an enigmatic spectral energy. In a delicate balance, the living and the dead coexisted in the cemetery as it was transformed into a theater of the macabre. The nights became a surreal tapestry of ghostly occurrences. As they appeared out of nowhere, hazy figures began to weave through the tombstones. They wandered aimlessly through the foggy cemetery landscape as I caught glimpses of them, eerie echoes of the past. They appeared to be stuck on this level of existence and unable to leave it. The encounters grew more frequent and unsettling as the days turned into weeks. The ghosts became more assertive. They were no longer satisfied with a passing glance to indicate their presence. The nighttime air was filled with their ethereal moans and sighs, and I could hear their echoed footsteps all around me. Within those haunted grounds, there was no clear distinction between the living and the dead. The apparitions were agitated one night in particular. The already blurry figures became even more obscured as a thick fog covered the cemetery. I moved forward despite my anxiety, my heart racing. Suddenly, the silence was pierced like a knife by a woman's mournful cry echoing through the night. It was a sound that rang with agony and despair, and it gave me shivers. In a desperate attempt to locate the source of the sound, I turned in its direction, but nothing could be seen. The woman's cries persisted, stalking me from a distance. She seemed to be imprisoned within the cemetery's spectral grasp, her tortured spirit shackled to this unholy ground forever. The straw that broke the camel's back was that. My soul was pierced by their cries of agony, and I experienced a crushing sense of helplessness as a result. I was overwhelmed by the realization that I was only a bystander in a world beyond my comprehension. I made up my mind at that precise moment that I could not bear to spend another night dealing with these supernatural occurrences. My hasty steps resounded loudly in the deserted hallways as I walked back to the security office. I felt as though an unseen force was urging me to leave because of how much the supernatural encounters weighed on me. My hands shook with anxiety as I gathered my possessions. I gave the old cemetery that had turned into my personal den of horrors one last look before exiting into the crisp night air. The grave markers, the statues, and the landscape were illuminated in an unsettling glow by the moon, which was low in the sky. I had the impression that the dead were saying goodbye to me and accepting my departure from their haunted world. I made a heartfelt vow to never go back to that eerie location as I resigned to the wind. I eventually left the cemetery behind, its mysteries and ghosts imprinted in my mind forever. The terror I felt while working as a security guard will always be a chilling reminder of the danger in some places, where the thin line separating the living from the dead is easily torn. Curious visitors will keep flocking to the old cemetery, but they will never fully comprehend the horrors hidden beneath its serene exterior. However, desperation can lead a man to do strange things. I never imagined myself to be the type to visit a cemetery at night. My cherished wife, Sarah, had been gone for 2 agonizingly long months. I missed her every single day, and the pain in my chest felt like a dull, lingering ache. I was standing at the cemetery's entrance one moonless night. My spine tingled as the wind rustled through the trees. I held a bouquet of roses in my shaking hand and made a point of honoring Sarah. I simply needed a brief interaction with her so I could express the things I could not do so while she was still alive. The only sounds in the eerily quiet graveyard were the rustling of the leaves and my own footsteps on the gravel path. My flashlight's dim illumination created eerie, long shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of the past. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was watching me and that the air was heaving with sorrow. I finally arrived at Sarah's grave. I knelt down to lay the roses on her final resting place as the tombstone gleamed dimly in the night. I cried as I muttered, "I miss you, Sarah. More than words can express. I adore you." I lingered there for what seemed like hours, absorbed in my sorrow and the recollections of our time together. My attention was then drawn to a strange sound coming from a few rows over of graves. It made a scraping sound like metal hitting the ground. I turned my flashlight toward the source of the noise as my heart skipped a beat. I noticed a man there, illuminated by the flashlight's dim glow. With a shovel in his hands and his clothes in tatters, he was crouched over a brand new grave. As I observed him digging frantically into the ground with erratic and frenzied movements, my blood froze. My voice was shaking as I yelled, "Hey! What in the name of hell are you doing?" The man froze, lifting his head to face me. His face was streaked with dirt, and his eyes were wide and crazed, like a madman's. He hissed, "I have to find it. It's down here! I have to find it!" in a voice that gave me chills. As my heart raced in my chest, I took a cautious step back. "What are you talking about when you say find?" He stayed silent. Instead, he began digging again with a newfound vigor as if possessed by some evil force. He was scratching at the grave with his shovel, and I could see the dirt flying through the air. I knew I had to leave because it was a grotesque and terrifying sight. I stumbled backward while maintaining a fixed gaze on the insane man. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, giving the operator a hushed description of my location. They said they would send assistance, but I knew it would take some time for them to show up. I heard the man muttering to himself as I hung up the phone. I'm confident that it is here. She revealed to me. I couldn't look away from him because my curiosity and fear were at odds. Who was this person? And what motivation could there be to disrespect a grave in such a way? It took place after that. The man's shovel hit something solid beneath the dirt with a sickening thud. With a jubilant cry, he exclaimed, "I've done it!" as he frantically dug with his hands, chucking dirt and clay aside. Long-term watching became unbearable for me. As I made my way back through the pitch-black cemetery, I turned and fled, my heart racing in my chest. I could hear sirens in the distance getting louder, signaling that assistance was approaching. The man was still standing by the grave when the police arrived, tightly gripping something. I watched in horror as they grappled him into the back of a squad car after having to use force to subdue him. The horrifying truth was revealed to me later. The man was looking for his own wife's remains, who had been interred in the cemetery months earlier. He had become fixated on locating a priceless family heirloom that he thought she had been interred with. He had excavated numerous graves in his insane search. I couldn't help but experience a perplexing mix of disgust and sympathy for the man. I stood there in the dimly lit cemetery, still reeling from the events of the previous night, thinking that grief can do terrible things to a person. I had the distinct impression that I had seen something incredibly unholy as I left the cemetery. I would have nightmares for years about that madman digging frantically in the pitch black. The cemetery was a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the hearts of even the most common people, despite the fact that I had gone there looking for solace with my beloved Sarah. As my wife, Nicole, and I traveled to the historic cemetery on the outskirts of town, the sun was beginning to set. We were there to pay our respects to Nicole's grandmother, who had passed away a few months earlier. A spooky atmosphere was created by the air's heavy concentration of the smell of decomposing leaves and the distant buzz of crickets. Although I didn't particularly enjoy visiting cemeteries, I would do anything to help Nicole during her difficult time. The light was fading, and long shadows danced all around us as we moved through the rows of worn-out gravestones. With tears in her eyes, Nicole held the bouquet of new flowers. We eventually arrived at her grandmother's grave, a simple stone monument tucked away beneath a gnarled oak tree. The flowers were placed on the grave as Sarah knelt down, her lips moving in a silent prayer. I remained motionless as I stood next to her. Only a distant owl's hoot could be heard over the cemetery's stillness. Despite the unsettling environment, it was a calm moment. But then I noticed something. A few rows over, 3 men had gathered together wearing ragged, mismatched clothing. I found their hats to be strange, which surprised me. They resembled something out of an antique witch costume because they were tall and pointed. The men appeared to be performing some sort of ritual as they gathered around a grave with their heads bowed. Nicole felt my touch as I muttered, "Do you see those guys over there?" She blinked and cocked an eyebrow in the direction I indicated. "It's so late. What are they doing here?" I replied, my unease growing, I don't know, but It seems like they're up to something strange. We remained silent as the men chanted low, guttural words that gave me chills as they went on. They appeared to be out of a horror film as their small, flickering candles cast ominous shadows on their faces. The temperature dropped, and it appeared as though a thick fog was rolling in, further obscuring our view. The realization that whatever these men were doing wasn't typical cemetery behavior made my heart race. Nicole gripped my arm with white-knuckled grit. We looked at each other anxiously. It was obvious we needed to leave. We didn't say anything but moved cautiously away from the unsettling scene, trying not to draw attention to ourselves. The chanting of the men, however, suddenly became louder and more agitated as we turned to leave. I got a chill from it. I muttered to Nicole, "We have to leave right away." Her eyes were wide with fear as she nodded. We quickened our pace, but as we approached the entrance to the cemetery, a terrifying scream resounded throughout the night. Both of us froze as fear began to spread through us. After removing their hats, the three men were standing next to the grave with bald heads covered in odd symbols. We turned around to see them. It was impossible to see their faces in the dim light, but their eyes shone with an otherworldly intensity. The moonlight gleamed off the blade of the small, intricate dagger that one of them held up. They were about to carry out an appalling, unfathomable act. As we hurriedly made our way to the door, I grabbed Sarah's hand and drew her along with me. The scream persisted into the night, growing more agonized by the second. We didn't turn around as we finally left the cemetery. Till we arrived at the security of our car parked down the road, we continued running while struggling for breath. My mind was consumed with the horrifying vision of those men in their peculiar hats carrying out some unholy ritual as my heart raced. We both felt utterly shaken as we made the silent drive home. We kept what we saw that night to ourselves, but the image of those men and their eerie ceremony lingered in our minds for weeks after. Even now, I can't help but wonder what evil forces were at work in that cemetery, and what might have happened if we had lingered a moment longer. It was clear, however, that we would never return to that location, and that the memory of that evening would live on as a genuine, unsettling cemetery horror tale.